The way we're going to structure this is kind of a conversation of two parts. The first is the kind of big picture stuff, really, I guess. Yep. And the second part, we get a little bit more personal. Not too personal, but a little bit more, just to get some reflections on your specific place in the world. But let me start with a big question, just to kick you off. There you go. Just to kick you off, which is, what system are you trying to change and why?
We, the Young Foundation, are trying to change the system and systems which lead to rising inequality. So that's a whole, I say systems because I think that's a whole set of nested systems and interlocking systems, which I would say our fundamental hunch, and it's unproven at the moment, is that most complex systems tend naturally towards inequality. The rich nodes get richer in networked, adaptive, complex systems for various reasons. And you therefore require organised agency to intervene to stop that from happening, because unbridled inequality leads to the non-sustainability of the system as a whole, which in this sense, I guess, means the economy.
So when you say a whole set of nested systems, you would include the economy as one of those?
Yes, so microeconomies. From the level of systems which mean that it's more expensive to be poor than to be rich, would be one sort of set of systems which leads to inequality leading to more inequality, if you see what I mean. I take a really trivial example to start the ball rolling. Something like my local publicly owned leisure centre. It's cheaper the longer you can pay in advance.
Right. Yeah.
The same is true of energy, water, of electricity, a whole set of expenses which ordinary people face in their lives. The poorer you are, the more expensive it is. So it's a kind of, it's a trapping system, if you like. But then at a more macro level, you're looking at the question of how financial services are structured more generally, how debt is structured, how employment markets work, how systems within and between companies are driving greater and greater income inequality, how the feminisation of various professions and their subsequent immiseration is driving gender inequality in quite complex ways, as you know. And then, I would look at systems of food and movement and space that are leading to the rise in chronic illness, which has a very high social gradient, and therefore makes it a sort of complex set of issues, which I know you've studied yourself, about how people, can live lives that aren't in what is effectively an obesogenic system, and so on and so forth. Right. So there are hundreds.
So any system that is part of contributing to this issue of inequality.
Yeah, that is our strategic focus.
Okay.
Yeah.
So are there any systems you wouldn't change?
I wouldn't change. I wouldn't seek to fundamentally change democracy, as in replace it with something else, but I think it can be considerably strengthened and improved. I wouldn't seek to fundamentally change capitalism, as in to replace that with something else. I think that's been tried reasonably thoroughly with reasonably disastrous results. So in that sense, we're taking as a given the current kind of social democratic capitalist system at the absolute macro level.
And just thinking about your vision and this desire to tackle or address inequality wherever you see it, I guess we're interested in how important it is when you're trying to change systems. How important is it to have a vision for the future or a goal of what you're trying to get to?
This, I think, is really complicated because I think one of the mistakes which we've repeatedly made is to have a vision in the sense of an answer or a set of answers that we want to get to in the way of a set of policies, maybe, and an outcome. And then what we tend to think is we can legislate for that. Whereas I think effective systems change actually happens much more organically. This means that it's very difficult to embark on the process because effectively what you want to do is, I start from an assumption that people flourish in communities, in overlapping communities, that if we understand deeply enough the way that these communities and families and extended families work, that we could design with those people different solutions and different systemic interventions that would countervail against this tendency towards inequality. So what we're not doing is taking, if you like, a traditional think tank approach to say, look, here's a vision of a fairer society. Now, will you please, legislate for this and introduce it by 2015, which has been where I think we've, constantly gone awry, as it were. So, yes, it is very important to have a guiding vision in the sense of things like what it is to be human, what the importance of diversity, the role of innovation and social innovation, the role of disruptive innovation, particularly important in systemic change, I think, and a sense of, how people's agency can be, how people can make common cause with each other and create effectively movements for systemic change.
Okay, so that leads on to another area I'm interested in getting your reflections on, which is in a lot of the theory around systems change, there are various sort of strategies and tactics that people talk about as part of your toolkit as a systems changer. I'm interested in your reflections on particular strategies and tactics you've used in work, system change work in the past, either ones that you think are critical and effective, or ones that actually are sort of a distraction and a bit of noise. So some reflections on that.
Wow, that's another huge question.
These are all big questions.
So I mentioned movement building, for example, and I think that's a really interesting, toolbox. How people go about building movements and organising themselves to create pressure for system level change. A lot of the things we're wrestling with are based on this this paradigm that if you tell people to behave differently, for example, or to behave more sensibly, that you will achieve the change you want. If you think of the work that you've done, for example, looking at obesity and childhood obesity in particular. Whereas what you want is something. So what I'm trying to get at is movement in the in a kind of a broader sense than we normally think of it. I don't mean a movement to save the bees. That is a perfectly worthy and respectable thing to be doing. I'm thinking about a movement that's based on people supporting each other around a story of how things could be different, and story is important. So movements don't come about by amassing large amounts of evidence and giving people persuasive arguments. They form around a narrative which ordinary people can understand and which resonates with them, and which allows them to make common cause with each other to change something that's unjust, or problematic, or making them ill, or barring them from educational or employment opportunity, or whatever.
So you're kind of articulating a vision or a sense of system change which is more organic and bottom-up than the kind of legislation you refer to slightly dismissively as part of the old think tank model.
Yeah, I mean, you still need legislation,
right?
And and we still need smart people thinking up good policies, and we still need primary and secondary legislation. There's no question about that. I don't think we can, fix everything from the bottom up using co-design and community-based approaches. I just think that we're way out of kilter on the balance between those things. So that's one whole set of strategies and tactics that's around, people getting together to find their agency, and which I'm broadly calling, movement building. And if you think people might not associate that with the Young Foundation, but if you go back and look at the movement for comprehensive schooling, the campaign to get the Open University started, the Consumers Association, and which, these were all movement-type strategies which Michael Young himself used, and which I think we have to rediscover the ability to do that, to achieve some of our objectives with regard to systemic inequality. So another set of tactics that we've used is ethnography. And I think although that's coming a little more back into vogue, as it were, at the moment, it's still fantastically underused and underappreciated and underinvested in. I think, for example, the government analytical services, you have economists, both macro and micro, statisticians, actuaries, and so on and so forth, in vast armies of quantitative analysts who are still, between all of them, quite incapable of seeing systemic problems coming or of coming up with answers to them. And we're completely bewitched by this idea that if we measure everything to the nth degree, we will come up with the analytical answer, this kind of crazy scientific kind of annexation of proper policy thought. And no ethnography. There's no government ethnography service. And yet, if you want to understand something like, why our early years interventions have been largely unsuccessful, it would seem to me the obvious place to start is by doing deep, multi-dimensional ethnography, where you actually, get inside a community and understand it properly, and how people's lives are actually structured, and what motivates them to do certain things, and why certain things are difficult, and why they hold themselves back or put themselves down, or I was in Cardiff on Thursday and Friday, and there was this slight sense of gloom that the reason why things are wrong and are not better in Wales, and the reason why it has one of the lowest average household incomes, for example, is because somehow they are to blame for their own condition. And this is why it's fundamentally important, I guess, to concentrate on systems change and for questions like this, because we've got this whole. One of the things I want to try and understand, and I'm sort of rambling here because I haven't yet figured this out. One of the things I'm really fascinated to try and understand is, how people end up holding themselves back and putting themselves down. And I feel at a gut level that it's connected to an approach whereby, there is increasingly this rather toxic narrative whereby we blame people for the situation that they're in. We blame individuals for the situation that they're in. And this has come about partly through atomisation and individualisation. And if you like, systems thinking is an alternative to that kind of radical individualising view of things. But it also comes out about partly, ironically, from the very best intentions, where we've focused on the poor, who then became the socially excluded, and then became, whatever terms you want to use. But these are just various different ways of saying what is wrong with these wretched people. We keep trying to help them, and they go on being poor. It's to take a parallel. It's like saying, well, we sent all these billions of dollars and euros and pounds to sub-Saharan Africa, decade after decade, and these people insist on going on being poor in sub-Saharan Africa. Let's stop sending them money. It's obviously not working. In fact, there's some very respectable arguments around that have said that, in fact, it was counterproductive and disruptive in a bad way, and distracting and so on. But when you take a systems view, when you take some steps back, you start to say, well, how does trade work with these countries? Who's taking their resources and who's getting the money for that? And what systems have we created for incentivising, a destructive approach to economy building and so on and so forth? That leads you to uncover a whole different set of answers.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. One of the themes that has come through in all of these conversations so far is about systems change as a form of rebalancing where power lies.
Yeah.
And also about giving people agency.
Yeah.
So I think that there's some...
Exactly, and I think when I talk about movement building, that's obviously both.
Yeah.
Both power rebalancing and agency. The two are obviously related to each other.
Yeah. So I'm interested in your mind then, where organisations and institutions fit into this picture of systems change. Do they have a role? What role is it?
Yeah, we need organisations and institutions. We went through a period after the Second World War of institutional innovation, both nationally and internationally, actually, and created a whole set of really valuable institutions which have done huge work in education, in healthcare, and a whole lot of other areas. So what happens is that institutions and organisations become not fit for purpose. That's why when I mentioned earlier the role of disruptive innovation, which what I've discovered actually is a lot of people are made very uncomfortable by this term disruptive innovation because of the word disruptive.
Right.
And it sounds like you mean kind of destructive. Well, actually, I do mean destructive. I mean destructive in the kind of Schumpeterian sense. And what I'm wondering is if the kind of disruptive innovation in the private sector, which constantly unseats incumbent companies and replaces them with other companies, is not needed with other institutions as well. And we haven't yet figured out how to do that, how to do it in a way that isn't, damaging or too disruptive to people. But it is quite clear that a lot of our institutions are absolutely not fit for purpose anymore. And they're not, to take my particular focus of inequality, they're not any longer a sufficient counterbalance to the tendency of complex systems towards inequality. Right. So we need institutional innovation.
Right. And do you think that disruptive innovation can come from within those institutions, or do you feel it needs to be a force from without?
I actually don't think it can come from within institutions generally. And, decades of public service reform activities motivated by, really, really well motivated and with many, many, many thousands of very, very brilliant people working on them, have produced pretty disappointing results on the whole. Now, I'm not sure why anyone thought that they would be different from companies in that sense. It's very interesting that for decades companies have known about the threat of disruptive innovation, and there is absolutely nothing they can do, with one or two, really remarkable exceptions of company reinvention where they've managed to, as it were, disrupt themselves. But everything about an organisation actually tends against that. And incumbent organisations seek to preserve their incumbency, of their very nature, whether they're public or private. There is actually, focusing on the division of, is the answer government, is the answer less government, smaller government, is the answer more private sector, more markets, and so on, distracts you from, it's almost the wrong division to be looking at. You know, what's interesting is that the incumbents support each other in these systems. If you're looking for systems, disruptive systems change, then you want to ask, you know, how are incumbent institutions and companies propping each other up and preserving and maintaining and fortifying their position, and they almost certainly need to be disrupted from outside in some way or other, which is where you come back to things like movement building or alternative institution building.
Okay, so I think you may have kind of covered this in some of your other answers, but just in case there's anything else you want to say on it. Theory of change, something that lots of people are talking about now in relation to systems, quite a lot of professionalisation of this idea of theory of change. Do you have one?
You know, implicitly, I'm sure I do, but, you know, I don't have a theory in that sense.
And if I were to ask you to draw out some of those implicit things, that jumble of thoughts in your head about how to go about achieving your goals?
Then that would be all of the kinds of things that I've been talking about, in a sense. You know, you need to have top-down and bottom-up strategies working hand in hand, as it were. If we were to do something about take a problem like pay differentials. You know, one fascinating thing is that Michael Young in The Rise of the Meritocracy, 1958, predicts that although pay differentials have been going down, and we're standing at that time at under 50 to 1 between executives and frontline workers within large organisations, he predicted that by the year 2000 they would be 500 to 1 for various reasons. And he got that more or less exactly right, which is an amazing piece of prediction in 1958. So you ask yourself, how would we reverse that? Because that's clearly a big driver, and it seems to be unstoppable. And the more that you concentrate wealth and power in a small group of people, the more able they are to defend and entrench that position. And you get to the point now where they've actually increasingly started to make labour at the bottom edge, as it were, unpaid altogether, so that you have to work for free to get into various industries, which is you know, corrupting and corrupt, and a great driver of inequality, I think. So, and there's been, you know, I think a rising awareness of the problems with internship and associated things. So, what would you do? Well, I think you'd want people to exercise their collective consumer power, for example. But to do that, you'd have to create some conditions that would allow it to happen. You might have to create some transparency. So I think, you know, you might start with a club of companies that sort of said, we're going to be completely transparent about pay differentials, amongst other things. Or you might start with a piece of legislation that said, you know, the government's going to, you know, make it attractive for companies to be clear about this. But at the end, you know, people are going to have to get together in the numbers and say, we are going to favour this company over that company because we like their approach to labour. Or you might try and, you know, you might look at the question of organised labour as well in parallel to those things and say, why is union membership falling, and is that something you could reverse, or does organised labour itself need some rethinking and some institutional disruption? Are there some alternative models? Are we still trying to organise labour as if we were, you know, in the 1940s and unfit for current labour market purpose? So you know, that's an incredibly messy answer in a way. But what I'm suspicious of is that there's a kind of meta theory of change that's, you know, going to take you very far, because once you get into a particular system that you want to change, or a particular set of effects that you want to try and manage, it's always going to have all of those complex components and the way they interplay with each other.
And I guess part of the skill of being a really good systems changer is understanding which elements to play in, when, and how.
Yes. Yeah. And I think, too much planning. People of a particular type, have kind of run away with the idea that you can do these kind of medium and long-term plans. It's really, it's really a fascinatingly old-fashioned idea, and yet it still holds incredible sway. So, but the alternative is really hard, because if you say we're going to be a bit opportunistic, and also because we're doing, because various parts of this are going to involve co-design or movement building, then of its very nature, it's going to be iterative. So when when I go as a social entrepreneur to look for funding and say we don't know what the answer is going to be, will you please give us some money to find out? That's a really hard, that's a hard case to make.
Yeah, I can see that. So who are your allies on this journey? Who are your enemies? You don't have to name names.
I actually see allies all over the place. I think there are bits of the corporate sector who are open for this discussion. Starting to be some people who are interested in that. I think the vacuity of corporate social responsibility is now generally widely accepted. And that people are starting to talk more about social innovation, and what would it be like actually for a company to make it a core strategic objective to have a positive social impact? What would it be like to move to a world where, in fact, that was such a competitive advantage that we would look back on those companies that had a negative social impact and think, how did that happen? Why did we allow that, in a sense? So I see allies there. I certainly see allies in public sector all over the place. Probably, I've always found this actually in my last 3 jobs, more at the city and regional level than at the national level. It's almost as if the national level is too big and too complicated and too hard, and the responsibilities, the stresses that the key decision makers are now under almost everywhere mean that they have really little time for a conversation about disruptive innovation. Right. And are anyway in a position where they're just not allowed to take the kind of risks that we need to be able to take to change some of these things. That's not true everywhere in the world. Interestingly, and if you look at Charlie Ledbetter's stuff on innovation at the edge, I think that's absolutely right. If you want to find fresh thinking on health and education, you go to Brazil and India and Africa rather than trekking back to Finland once again to see how they're doing the Finnish approach to schooling. It's so. Not that I've got anything against the Finns. I think they're great, but I think that is part of the answer. So allies, the third sector, or whatever you want to call it, is of course full of potential allies. But I think it has just as many problems as the other 2 sectors. And one of the fascinating things actually is that most interesting answers probably involve all 3. And I'd even add a 4th sector, which is maybe academics. I think they're in a slightly different group. What is fascinating when you're trying to come up with solutions that involve all 3 or 4 of those sectors is that most of them have blank incomprehension about why the other sectors are there. I mean, they're really, it's always absolutely fascinating to me, and it's partly by chance. I've spent about a third of my career in each sector, but so I've been lucky, I guess. But certainly, when I was spending a lot of time in Silicon Valley, they had no idea why government was there at all.
What's behind that, do you think?
Kind of semi-organised self-interest,
Right.
willful blindness.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's a neoliberal myth, isn't there? I talked about this individual, you know, the role of atomisation at the root of a lot of our systems problems. There was, you know, we created a kind of myth that, you know, the individual is responsible for their own destiny. And again, this is what Michael Young was writing about in The Rise of the Meritocracy. What happens when you tell people that it's down to their hard work plus intelligence, how far they get in life, that they have, you know, it's hard to believe something that's against your self-interest. It's hard to discover it and learn about it and think about it properly and seriously. And, you know, if I'm a very successful IT entrepreneur or senior vice president at a large IT corporate, I'm really I have a strong interest in believing that it's my brilliance that has made me so wealthy, and to forget that the education systems, transport systems, health systems, intellectual property systems, defence systems, and all of these other things that created and made the environment in which it was possible for me to flourish, in which it's possible for any market to flourish, in which it's possible to find employees who are worth having, and so on and so forth, all came from a different sector.
So we have a kind of inbuilt tendency to not see the system, or to overestimate what our contribution is as against the kind of other systems within which we live.
I think that's a natural human tendency. Yeah, and you know, there are all those wonderful experiments about how people, you know, really systematically overestimate their own understanding of things.
Yeah. And on that, moving on to you.
Yeah.
I would like you to give me an example of a system change of some sort that you think is really inspiring. Or can you? Why don't we make it more open?
What's really inspired me? I guess, you know, I would... It's really hard. I keep thinking of problems with the examples that I'm coming up with.
It's all right. You can have one and acknowledge it's not perfect.
Yeah. You know, I think if you look back over a longer time span, it can be quite inspiring, because you can see that what has been happening in the last 30 years is not the way it's always been. It's not the direction of travel we've always had. And we've actually faced these sorts of challenges before and come up with radically different answers. We have changed these systems. And if you think of things like you know, the abolition of slavery, or the abolition of child labour, the improvement of working conditions, the you know, the protection of workers, the enfranchisement of women, the erosion of racism and homophobia and sexism. These are all huge positive changes in large systems that looked immovable. So, you know, organised agency and a bit of you know, a bit of movement building can actually take you a long way.
But your examples take us back.
You wanted something recent.
No. I'm just saying that's an interesting reflection, isn't it? I mean, are there things recent or?
I guess, you know, from recent times, I find what's been happening in Brazil over the last decade and a half, that's pretty inspiring, actually.
What specifically?
You know, I think deciding that it would be possible to break up the cycle of boom and bust and drive continuous economic growth inclusively. So to drive growth in tandem with falling inequality. And this required not just, you know, lots of vision and leadership and good policy, but also, you know, a lot of work, a lot of civil society work was done on that, and some really creative policies of thinking differently about things like social security systems. So, yeah, I think that's been pretty inspiring if you want something from recent times.
Great, thank you. Okay, and now tell me, how do you describe your work to people who aren't in the same business as you? How do you explain what you do?
Oh, that is such a good question. I mean, you know, the easiest thing, I was talking to the chairman of my trustees recently, Tim Allen, you know, and he said, well, we can try and perfect this statement of who we are, what we believe in and what we do endlessly. You know, and we have been trying to do that. You know, and in the end, you know, I find myself in discussions with people where they say, give it to me in one sentence. And at the moment, my best effort at that one sentence would be, you know, we do practical, disruptive social innovation based on deep ethnography to address the systemic and institutional causes of inequality. That's not a very good sentence, you know, but it's hard to do one sentence. But back to Tim's point, you know, he said in the end, actually what people judge you by is what you do rather than what you say you do. And what we've always fallen back on is saying, look, we did the Open University and the ESRC and the Consumers Association and more recently Uprising and the Studio Schools Trust and the U and you know, these are, go and look at our work and you'll understand who we are and what we do.
Now, you've answered that in relation to the Young Foundation.
The Young Foundation.
I'm interested in how you describe what you do as well.
So what I normally tell people is that my role is here and previously to find brilliant and diverse groups of people. So if you want to build a world-class innovation team, then you have to bring really quite different types of background, educational, cultural, social, technical backgrounds together, and then stop them from killing each other. Because, you know, they don't speak the same language, they don't value the same things necessarily. So, you know, I try and create a frame so that we know, you know, that we're all roughly going in the same direction. And I try and create some, you know, some common language, and I try and constantly intervene to stop people from misunderstanding each other. But I've found that, you know, the great temptation and the far easier thing to do is build a homogenous team of people who really think like each other and really get on well with each other. And groups like that have rarely ever done much in the way of innovation. Just as groups that are hugely well funded have rarely, if ever, done very much in the way of innovation. So it means that you're in a constantly tenuous position. It means that you're constantly desperate for funds. It means that you're constantly holding a kind of unstable group of people together. But you don't actually need a very huge number of people to do quite extraordinary innovations, I don't think, if you've got the right bunch. So, you know, my job is to try and find them. And I actually once heard a great business lecture by a guy who said, you know, very senior managers and leaders should spend 75% of their time on recruitment, whereas most spend maybe 5%. Because actually what you spend all the rest of your time on is managing the consequences of not having recruited the best possible people. Right. So if you could get that bit right, you know, you could go and play golf the remaining 25% of the time.
Yeah. Okay.